Since since we are going, the story of my introduction to projective verse is there on the post, which people can refer to at paulenelson.com. But I'd love it if you could tell us how you first became aware of the essay Projective Verse.
You know, I started thinking about that when you suggested that to me this morning, and I'm like, when did I? Because I think, unlike you, it wasn't really a big light bulb moment. So, but when I was trying to remember when I first read it, I'm like, where did I first read it? And I know that I first read it in the great Don Allen New American Poetry Anthology, in the collection of statements on poetics in the back. That was way early. That was like I was still in college, so that would have been late 70s in Bloomington, Indiana, and they weren't teaching this poetry at Indiana University then. But I found the book in one of the many wonderful bookstores in Bloomington, and I don't think the essay so much registered with me at the time because there was so much else, and I was still, absorbing Pound and Williams then. But that was my introduction to Olson. So what I will say is that the first work of Olson's that really struck me was the first one in that book, which is The Kingfishers, which I was really drawn to, which I certainly didn't understand and still don't entirely. But the one thing that struck me, which was, I guess, the light bulb moment, was what does not change is the will to change, and that is true not just in poetry and in poetics, but in politics and in life. And then later on, continuing, I guess when I really went back to projective verse in depth, I did an independent study on Olson at University of Iowa in grad school with the American literature scholar Sherman Paul. And he said something that's stuck with me ever since with regard to poetry and poetics in general. It doesn't mean a thing if it's not about how you live your life. And that connected to what Olson said in the essay, that projective verse is not just about a way of writing, it is about a stance toward reality. So that's when I really, I guess, kind of got what he was about.
Excellent. I'm finding it difficult to make sure that everyone's muted. So I'm not sure how to do that except to manually mute all folks. And that's going to be difficult as people come in. So anyway, I'm going to share the screen and share the text and get things rocking here at 4:03. Chuck, fire away.
Okay. Projective verse, projective, percussive, perspective versus the non-projective, or what a French critic calls closed verse, that verse which print bred and which is pretty much what we have had in English and American and have still got despite the work of Pound and Williams.
It led Keats already 100 years ago to see it, Wordsworth's, Milton's, in the light of the egotistical sublime, and it persists at this latter day as what you might call the private soul at any public wall.
Up and put into itself certain laws and possibilities of breath, of the breathing of the man who writes, as well as of his listenings. The revolution of the ear, 1910, the trochees heave, asks it of the younger poets.
I want to do two things. First, try to show what projective or open verse is, what it involves in its act of composition, how in distinction from the non-projective it is accomplished, and two, suggest a few ideas about what stance toward reality brings such verse into being, what that stance does, both to the poet and his reader. The stance involves, for example, a change beyond and larger than the technical and may, the way things look, lead to new poetics and to new concepts from which some sort of drama, say, or of epic perhaps, may emerge.
First, some simplicities that a man learns if he works in open, or what can also be called composition by field, as opposed to inherited line, stanza, overall form, what is the old base of the non-projective. One, the kinetics of the thing. A poem is energy transferred from where the poet got it. He will have some several causations by way of the poem itself to all the way over to the reader. Okay. Then the poem itself must at all points be a high energy construct and at all points an energy discharge. So, how is the poet to accomplish same energy? How is he? What is the process by which a poet gets in? At all points, energy, at least the equivalent of the energy which propelled him in the first place, yet an energy which is peculiar to verse alone, and which will be, obviously, also different from the energy which the reader, because he is a third term, will take away.
This is the problem which any poet who departs from closed form is specially confronted by, and it involves a whole series of new recognitions. From the moment he ventures into field composition, puts himself in the open, he can go by no track other than the one the poem underhand declares for itself. Thus, he has to behave and be instant by instant aware of some several forces just now beginning to be examined. It is much more, for example, this push than simply such a one as Pound puts so wisely to get us started, the musical phrase, go by it, boys, rather than by the metronome.
2 is the principle, the law which presides conspicuously over the composition, and when obeyed is the reason why a projective poem can come into being. It is this: form is never more than an extension of content. Or so it got phrased by one, R. Creeley, and it makes absolute sense to me with this possible corollary that right form in any given poem is the only and exclusively possible extension of content underhand. There it is, brothers, sitting there for use.
Now, 3, the process of the thing, how the principle can be made so to shape the energies that the form has accomplished. And I think it can be boiled down to one statement, first pounded into my head by Edward Dahlberg. One perception must immediately and directly lead to a further perception. It means exactly what it says, is a matter of, at all points, even, I should say, of our management of the daily reality as of the daily work. Get on with it. Keep moving. Keep in speed. The nerves, their speed. The perceptions, theirs. The acts, the split second acts, the whole business. Keep it moving as fast as you can, citizen. And if you also set up as a poet, use the process at all points. In any given poem, always one perception must move instanter on another. So there we are, fast. There's the dogma. And its excuse, its usableness in practice, which gets us, it ought to get us, inside the machinery now, 1950, of how projective verse is made.
If I hammer, if I recall in and keep calling in the breath, the breathing as distinguished from the hearing, it is for cause. It is to insist upon a part that breath plays in verse, which has not, due, I think, to the smothering of the power of the line by too set a concept of foot, has not been sufficiently observed or practiced, but which has to be if verse is to advance to its proper force and place in the day, now ahead. I take it that projective verse teaches is this lesson, that the verse will only do in which a poet manages to register both the acquisitions of his ear and the pressures of his breath.
Let's start from the smallest particle of all, the syllable. It is the king and pin of versification, what rules and holds together the lines, the larger forms of a poem. I would suggest that verse here and in England dropped this secret from the late Elizabethans to Ezra Pound, lost it in the sweetness of meter and rhyme in a honeyhead. The syllable is one way to distinguish the original success of blank verse and its falling off with Milton.
It is by their syllables that words juxtapose in beauty, by these particles of sound, as clearly as by the sense of the words which they compose, in any given instance, because there is a choice of words. The choice, if a man is in there, will be, spontaneously, the obedience of his ear to the syllables. The fineness and the practice lie here, at the minimum and source of speech.
O western wind, when wilt thou blow? And the small rain down shall rain. O Christ, that my love were in my arms, and I in my bed again.
It would do no harm as an act of correction to both prose and verse as now written, if both rhyme and meter, and in the quantity words, both sense and sound, were less in the forefront of the mind than the syllable. If the syllable, that fine creature, were more allowed to lead the harmony on. with this warning to those who would try, to step back here to this place of the elements and minims of language is to engage speech where it is least careless and least logical. Listening for the syllables must be so constant and so scrupulous, the exaction must be so complete that the assurance of the ear is purchased at the highest 40 hours a day price. For from the root out, from all over the place, the syllable comes, the figures of the dance.
Is comes from the Aryan root as, to breathe. The English not equals the Sanskrit na, which may come from the root na, to be lost, to perish. Be is from bu, to grow.
I say that the syllable king and that it is spontaneous this way. The ear which has collected, which has listened, the ear which is so close to the mind that it is the mind's, that it has the mind's speed. It is close another way. The mind is brother to the sister and is, because it is so close, the drying force, the incest, the sharpener. It is from the union of the mind and the ear that the syllable is born. But the syllable is only the first child of the incest of verse. Always that Egyptian thing, it produces twins. The other child is the line. And together, these two, the syllable and the line, they make a poem. They make that thing, what shall we call it? The boss of all, the single intelligence. And the line comes, I swear it, from the breath, from the breathing of the man who writes, at the moment that he writes. And thus it is here that the daily work, the work gets in, for only he, the man who writes, can declare at every moment the line, its metric, and its ending, where its breathing shall come to termination.
The trouble with most work to my taking, since the breaking away from traditional lines and stanzas, and from such wholes as, say, Chaucer's Troilus or S's Lear, is contemporary workers go lazy right here where the line is born.
Let me put it baldly. The two halves are the head, by way of the ear, to the syllable, the heart, by way of the breath, to the line.
And the joker, that it is in the first half of the proposition, that in composing one lets it rip, and that it is in the second half. Surprise, it is the line. That's the baby that gets, as the poem is getting made, the attention, the control, that it is right here in the line that the shaping takes place each moment of the going.
I am dogmatic that the head shows in the syllable. The dance of the intellect is there among them, prose or verse. Consider the best minds you know in this here business. Where does the head show? Is it not precise here in the swift currents of the syllable? Can't you tell a brain when you see what it does just there? It is true what the master says he picked up from confusion. All the thoughts men are capable of can be entered on the back of a postage stamp. So is it not the play of a mind we are after? Is it not that shows whether a mind is there at all?
The elements of language are finite, but the poet, through his attentiveness, play of mind, is the person who makes use of words in a particular, sophisticated way.
And the threshing floor for the dance, is it anything but the line? And when the line is a deadness, is it not a heart which has gone lazy? Is it not suddenly slow things, similes, say, adjectives or such that we are bored by? For there is a whole flock of rhetorical devices which have now to be brought under a new bead, now that we cite with the line. Simile is only one bird who comes down too easily. The descriptive functions generally have to be watched every second in projective verse because of their easiness, and thus their drain on the energy which composition by field allows into a poem. Any slackness takes off attention, that crucial thing, from the job in hand, from the push of the line underhand at the moment, under the reader's eye, in his moment. Observation of any kind is, like argument in prose, properly previous to the act of the poem, and if allowed in, must be so juxtaposed, apposed, set in, that it does not for an instant sap the going energy of the content toward its form.
It comes to this, the whole aspect of the newer problems. We now enter actually the large area of the whole poem into the field, if you like, where all the syllables and all the lines must be managed in their relations to each other. It is a matter, finally, of objects, what they are inside a poem, how they got there, and once there, how they are to be used. This is something I want to get to in another way in part two. But for the moment, let me indicate this, that every element in an open poem, the syllable, the line, as well as the image, the sound, the sense, must be taken up as participants in the kinetic of the poem just as solidly as we are accustomed to take what we call the objects of reality, and that these elements are to be seen as creating the tensions of a poem just as totally as do those other objects create what we know as the world.
The objects which occur at every given moment of composition, of recognition, we can call it, are, can be, must be treated exactly as they do occur therein, and not by any ideas or preconceptions from outside the poem, must be handled as a series of objects in field in such a way that a series of tensions, which they also are made to hold, and to hold exactly inside the content and context of the poem which has forced itself through the poet and them into being.
Because breath allows all the speech force of language back in. Speech is the solid of verse, is the secret of a poem's energy. Because now a poem has, by speech, solidity, everything in it can now be treated as solids, objects, things, and though insisting upon the absolute difference of the reality of the verse from that other dispersed and distributed thing, yet each of these elements of a poem can be allowed, once the poem is well composed, to keep, as those other objects do, their proper confusions.
Which brings us up immediately, bang, against tenses, in fact, against syntax, in fact, against grammar generally, that is, as we have inherited it. Do not tenses, must they not also be kicked around anew in order that time, that other governing absolute, may be kept, as must the space tensions of a poem, immediate, contemporary to the acting on you of the poem? I would argue that here too, the law of the line, which projective verse creates, must be hewn to, obeyed, and that the conventions which logic has forced on syntax must be broken open as quietly as must the two set feet of the old line. But an analysis of how far a new poet can stretch the very conventions on which communication by language rests is too big for these notes, which are meant, I hope it is obvious, merely to get things started.
Let me just throw in this. It is my impression that all parts of speech suddenly, in composition by field, are fresh for both sound and percussive use, spring up like unknown, unnamed vegetables in the patch when you work it come spring. Now take Hart Crane. What strikes me in him is the singleness of the push to the nominative, his push along that one arc of freshness, the attempt to get back to word as handle. If logos is word as thought, what is word as noun? As, pass me that, as Newman Shea used to ask at the galley table, put a jib on the blood, will ya? But there is a loss in Crane of what Fenollosa is so right about in syntax. The sentence as first act of nature, as lightning, as passage of force from subject to object, quick, in this case, from heart to me, in every case from me to you, the verb between two nouns. Does not heart miss the advantages by such an isolated push, miss the point of the whole front of syllable, line, field, and what happened to all language and to the poem as a result?
I return you now to London, to beginnings, to the syllable, for the pleasures of it to intermit.
If music be the food of love, play on. Give me excess of it, that surfeiting the appetite may sicken and so die. That strain again, it had a dying fall. Oh, it came over my ear like the sweet sound that breathes upon a bank of violets, stealing and giving odor.
What we have suffered from is manuscript, press, the removal of verse, lost my place, from its producer and its reproducer, the voice, a removal by one, by two removes from its place of origin and its destination. For the breath has a double meaning, which Latin had not yet lost.
The irony is, from the machine has come one gain not yet sufficiently observed or used, but which leads directly on toward projective verse and its consequences. It is the advantage of the typewriter that, due to its rigidity and its space precisions, it can, for a poet, indicate exactly the breath, the pauses, the suspensions, even of syllables, the juxtaposition, even of parts of phrases which he intends. For the first time, the poet has the stave and the bar a musician has had. For the first time, he can, without the convention of rhyme and meter, record the listening he has done to his own speech, and by that one act indicate how he would want any reader, silently or otherwise, to voice his work. It is time we picked the fruits of the experiments of Cummings, Pound, Williams, each of whom has, after his way, already used the machine as a scoring to his composing, as a script to its vocalization. It is now only a matter of the recognition of the conventions of composition by feel for us to bring into being an open verse as formal as the closed, with all its traditional advantages.
If a contemporary poet leaves a space as long as the phrase before it, he means that space to be held by the breath an equal length of time. If he suspends a word or syllable at the end of a line, this was most Cummings' edition, he means that time to pass that it takes the eye, that hair of time suspended to pick up the next line. If he wishes a pause so light it hardly separates the words, yet does not want a comma, which is an interruption of the meaning rather than the sounding of the line, follow him when he uses a syllable the typewriter has ready to hand.
What does not change is the will to change.
Observe him when he takes advantage of the machine's multiple margins to juxtapose.
Said he, to dream takes no effort, to think is easy, to act is more difficult.
But for a man to act after he has taken thought, this is the most difficult thing of all.
Each of these lines is a progressing of both meaning and the breathing forward, and then a backing up, without a progress or any kind of movement outside the unit of time local to the idea.
There is more to be said in order that this convention be recognized, especially in order that the revolution out of which it came may be so forwarded that work will get published to offset the reaction now afoot to return verse to inherited forms of cadence and rhyme. But what I want to emphasize here, by this emphasis on the typewriter as the personal and instantaneous recorder of the poet's work, is the already projective nature of verse as the sons of Pound and Williams are practicing it. Already they are composing as though verse was to have the reading its writing involved, as though not the eye but the ear was to be its measurer, as though the intervals of its composition could be so carefully put down as to be precisely the intervals of its registration. For the ear, which once had the burden of memory to quicken it, rhyme and regular cadence were its aids, and have merely lived on in print after the oral necessities were ended, can now again, that the poet has his means, be the threshold of projective verse.
2, which gets us to what I promised, the degree to which the projective involves a stance toward reality outside a poem, as well as a new stance toward reality of a poem itself. It is a matter of content, the content of Homer, of Euripides, or of Simi, as distinct from that which I might call the more literary masters. From the moment the projective purpose of the act of verse is recognized, the content does. It will change. If the beginning and the end is breath, voice in its largest sense, then the material of verse shifts. It has to. It starts with the composer. The dimension of his line itself changes, not to speak of the change in his conceiving of the matter he will turn to, of the scale in which he imagines that matter's use.
I myself would pose the difference by physical image. It is no accident that Pound and Williams were both involved variously in a movement which got called objectivism. But that word was then used in some sort of a necessary quarrel, I take it, with subjectivism. It is now too late to be bothered with the latter. It has excellently done itself to death, even though we are all caught in its dying.
What seems to be a more valid formulation for present use is objectism, a word to be taken to stand for the kind of relation of man to experience which a poet might state as the necessity of a line or a work to be as wood is, to be as clean as wood is as it issues from the hand of nature, to be shaped as wood can be when a man has had his hand to it. Objectivism is the getting rid of the lyrical interference of the individual as ego, of the subject and his soul, that peculiar presumption by which Western man has interposed himself between what he is as a creature of nature, with certain instructions to carry out, and those other creations of nature which we may, with no derogation, call objects. For a man is himself an object, whatever he may take to be his advantages. The more likely to recognize himself as such, the greater his advantages, particularly at that moment that he achieves an humilitas sufficient to make him of use. It comes to this: the use of a man, by himself and thus by others, lies in how he conceives his relation to nature, that force to which he owes his somewhat small existence. If he sprawl, he shall find little to sing but himself, and shall sing. Nature has such paradoxical ways by way of artificial forms outside of himself. But if he stays inside himself, if he is contained within his nature as he is participant in the larger force, he will be able to listen, and his hearing through himself will give him secrets, objects share. And by an inverse law, his shapes will make their own way. It is in this sense that the projective act, which is the artist's act in the larger field of objects, leads to dimensions larger than the man. For a man's problems, the moment he takes speech up in all its fullness, is to give his work his seriousness, a seriousness sufficient to cause the thing he makes to try to take its place alongside the things of nature. This is not easy. Nature works from reverence, even in her destruction. Species go down with a crash. But breath is man's special qualification as animal. Sound is a dimension he has extended. Language is one of his proudest acts. And when a poet rests in these as they are in his proudest acts, and when a poet rests in these as they are in himself, in his physiology, if you like, but the life in him for all that, then he, if he chooses to speak from these roots, works in that area where nature has given him size, projective size.
It is projective size that the play The Trojan Women possesses, for it is able to stand, is it not, as its people do, beside the Aegean, and neither Andromache nor the sea suffer diminution. In a less heroic but equally natural dimension, Seami causes the fisherman and the angel to stand clear in Hagoromo. And Homer, who is such an unexamined cliche that I do not think I need to press home in what scale Nausicaa's girls wash their clothes. Such works, I should argue, and I use them simply because their equivalents are yet to be done, could not issue from men who conceived verse without the full relevance of human voice, without relevance to where lines come from in the individual who writes. Nor do I think it accident that at this end point of the argument, I should use, for examples, 2 dramatists and an epic poet. For I would hazard to guess that if projective verse is practiced long enough, is driven ahead hard enough along the course I think it dictates, verse again can carry much larger material than it is carried in our language since the Elizabethans. But it can't be jumped. We are only at the beginnings. And if I think that the cantos make more dramatic sense than do the plays of Mr. Eliot, it is not because I think they have solved the problem, but because the methodology of the verse in them points a way by which, one day, the problem of a larger content and of larger forms may be solved. Eliot is, in fact, a proof of a present danger, of too easy a going on in the practice of verse as it has been, rather than as it must be practiced. There's no question, for example, that Eliot's line, from Prufrock on down, has speech force, is dramatic, is, in fact, one of the most notable lines since Dryden.
I suppose it stemmed immediately to him from Browning, as did so many of Pound's early things. In any case, Eliot's line has obvious relations backwards to the Elizabethans, especially to the soliloquy. Yet O.M. Eliot is not projective. It could even be argued, and I say this carefully, As I have said all things about the non-projective, having considered how much each of us must save himself after his own fashion, and how much, for that matter, each of us owes to the non-projective and will continue to owe, as both go alongside each other. But it could be argued that it is because Eliot has stayed inside the non-projective that he fails as a dramatist, that his root is mind alone, and a scholastic mind at that, no high intelletto despite his apparent clarities, and that in his listenings he has stayed there where the ear and mind are, has only gone from his fine ear outward rather than, as I say, a projective poet will, down through the workings of his own throat to that place where breath comes from, where breath has its beginnings, where drama has come from, where the coincidence is all act springs. Mamma mia, that's not an easy thing to do.
There you have it.
There it is, absolutely. So I would love to entertain questions. So maybe people can chat them or note that they want to say something. But I want to make a couple of points. As I'm trying to write down as I'm scrolling up and as I'm looking for my place. And Levertov said a great corollary to one of the early lines in it: form is never more than an extension of content. Levertov said, form is never more than a revelation of content. And I think that's more accurate. And we hear the first line too often. And the Levertov line, not often enough, I think. And then the line, least careless and least logical. I just love that. I also love Olson's reference to divinity. He calls it the single intelligence, and that's a good enough phrase for me. And his notion that simile and adjective are two birds that come down all too easily when you cite with the line. The last thing I wrote a note about is tense, in the present tense. And I don't know if it's in Olson's prose or where I first read that the present tense is the mythic. And so I think that the mythic size is what Olson's after, is what he's talking about in its largeness. So those are some of the points I would bring up for potentially for conversation, or just things that struck me again listening to them.
You know, Creeley had something further to add, further commentary about the form is never more than an extension of content too, since Olson was quoting him. He said, and I think semi-jokingly, but he said, I could have just as easily said content is never more than an extension of form. The point being that they're co-equal. It's not content is extension of form. It is that particular content has only one specific form.
Right. And you understand that when you write projectively, which is a very difficult thing to ascertain, I think. When Michael McClure first told me, read this essay out loud, because Olson wrote it in the style of Pound, rather pedantic. And so you read it out loud. And so I read it onto a tape that I recorded at the radio station doing the graveyard shift at KPLU, the jazz station, and then listened to that tape over and over and over and over. And I wondered, am I writing projectively? It seems to. I write quickly. I don't like to go back and do a lot of editing of the poem. And then later I would read, Denise Levertov said, if you have to do extensive editing to a poem, it didn't incubate long enough. And then I read Gary Snyder, who said his editing is more of a fine tuning than anything else. And all those things I related to in the early part of my quote unquote poetry career. So I began to realize that, yes, I was in fact writing projectively. And yes, it was a matter of time before I started meeting people like Michael McClure, who passed on May 4th of this past year. And with him, the most practiced practitioner of projective verse is gone, along with Diane DePrima, who also died this year, and who not only that there's that great picture of her with Charles Olson. Olson's so much bigger than her that it's kind of comical. But she also visited Ezra Pound when he was at St. Elizabeth's. So there's a link to one of the huge sources for Olson of the essay. So those two poets dying this year were huge blows to projective verse, which I found out about very late. And many people would argue by the time it and Black Mountain School were over, and the language school of poetry had not only taken it over, but it already had its arc by the time Michael McClure was telling me about projective verse. So I caught on to these things late, but I feel good about where I am and my knowledge and practice of this. And I do think it's a life-changing practice. Absolutely agree with Olson.
And I would add Joanne Kiger to that list of McClure and DePrima too. I think she's a exemplary practitioner of projective verse, especially in the appearance of her poems on the page.
Yes, she very much understood that composition by field. I love Michael's critique of poetry that continues to be left-hand margin justified. Michael called it lawnmower poetry. Yeah, I got a kick out of that. You don't have to mute yourself, Chuck. It would be okay to hear you laugh. But yeah, that, you got the first line, it goes, and then it comes back, and then it comes back. Somebody I saw on Twitter, somebody was criticizing C.A. Conrad for the shapes of his poems. And I said, must be a fan of lawnmower poetry. And he got a kick out of that. So there you have it. How it looks on the page. I mean, it's an opportunity to be creative with it while also registering how one would like it to be read. And I think that's very important. And, when I hear people read their work and I'm looking at the text and I don't hear them at all referencing the line breaks or any of the lineation, I wonder what is the logic that makes up their lineation. And I would also, bring Sam Hamill in, who really understood projective verse, although his practice of it was not like McClure's, but he definitely knew projective verse and has a lot of work that I think is projective. Sam said, if you're not reading it like it is on the page, then what is the logic behind it? So it also, the line, you can tell a poet's ear by the line breaks. That I think was one of the most important things that Sam ever told me, in addition to all the beautiful things that he told me about what it means to live the life of a poet, which is, I think, what Olson is getting at. When an act of composition is changing your life, then this is what poetry is supposed to do. It's supposed to make you a more perceptive person. It's supposed to make you a more humble person. Olson talks about, and humilitas sufficient to make him of use, and more aware. So I think I feel that it is successful in all those, which is why I want to read it on Olson's what would have been his 110th birthday, and oddly enough would have been my dad's 92nd birthday. My dad and Olson shared December 27th as birthdays. Well, Chuck, I don't see a whole lot of questions being raised in the chat. I know that my putting the link on the Facebook page for the August Poetry Postcard Fest had a lot of puzzled comments, people reading it, thinking it was too dense. And so I hope that they would attend and ask what they found puzzling about it. But seeing no questions, chat function is disabled, Ian says. And I'm going to go to the chat, to the security. And I thought I had, there we go. Chat is now abled. So take a couple of minutes to see if anyone does have a chat. Ian, if you like, you can unmute yourself and just ask the question at this point.
Sure, Paul. Hey, I was wondering if either of you would care to talk about Olson's relationship with Fenollosa. He mentions him, several times in this essay, and it's really clear that Fenollosa's essay, "The Chinese Written Character as a Medium for Poetry," whatever the full title of that is, had a tremendous effect upon him and his formulation of projective verse.
Chuck, you want to attend to that?
I don't know too much about that specifically, actually. So although it seems to me that somewhere in Olson's collected prose, there was another essay in which Fenollosa was prominent, but I can't think of exactly where that is.
Mm-hmm. I do know that Fenollosa and the Fenollosa Pound connection, and he's going back in his library to get the book, and I have mine about a little closer than that. I do know that Fenollosa and his ideas were a huge influence on Pound. And I will say also that Diane DePrima actually photocopied the Fenollosa essay that you referenced and mailed it to me back in the day. So she, as a projective poet, would have found some value in that essay. So other than that, it's a little bit beyond my scope. And Chuck is going through his fat Charles Olson collected prose from the University of California.
Not finding it right away, but I might.
Well, we can save it for a later date. Thank you.
Ian, you and I will be picking up this conversation, I'm sure, in the near future.
Yeah, wonderful.
I've just tried to unmute myself. Is that something I can do?
You can, Robert, and you're on. Nice to see you here.
Okay, thank you. I would just comment on that briefly. It's been a while since I've read the Fenollosa essay, but I read it dozens of times back in my day. And it seems to me that the key term for Olson coming out of the Fenollosa essay would be the idea of image. And for Olson, however, the image becomes associated with the term object. And of course, object is an important word in the projective verse essay. And just as image was like perhaps the most important thing for Pound in trying to develop a sense of how a new poetics could be conceived and created. You remember he came up with those three wonderful terms, logopoeia, phanopoeia, and melopoeia. And phanopoeia, of course, is the casting of the image upon the visual imagination. And of course, I think what he was up against, even more so than Olson and poets later, was how could you construct a poem in free verse that would retain something of the formal structure of traditional verse? What would give it coherence? And for Pound, I think the most important thing was image. I mean, the other two elements are very, very important as well. But image is the thing, it was, which he later called the ideogrammic method, that would give coherence in his mind to the cantos, for example. And I think that holds all the way up into Olson and all the so-called Black Mountain and post-Black Mountain poets. But when we come to Olson's essay, it seems to me one of the neatest things is his concentration on the syllable and the idea of the syllable as being something which is which comes before the idea of logic. Because even the image is often associated in our mind with an idea, right? Ideas into action, those kinds of sensibility. But the object or the syllable are in a sense pre-logical. And that's one of the things that Olson is hammering in that essay. And I think that's probably the thing about projective verse, which gives it its greatest significance, that he says we have to look at nature and see ourselves as part of nature, as objects, sharing the same thing that the objects of nature shares. And understand that our language is constructed from that same world, that the sounds of language, which emanate as syllables for the most part, are as pre-logical as the things that are going on around us all the time. And so we have, as it were, a rather happy connection. I mean, we're not quite as lost as we might be, I think. Not because we can understand nature necessarily, but because we can relate to nature. I think that's the key word here, that we can be part of nature, not separate from nature. Mm-hmm. And that's a whole different humanism, or if post-humanism, that Olson is constructing for us. A way to try to understand the composition by field is getting back in the poem and back into nature simultaneously. So, yeah.
There's a lot there, Robert. Thank you for that. The syllable, when one is led by the syllable, that's really, I think, where sound comes in, especially for me as a practitioner, I think. And I go to the poetics of Duke Ellington, who said, if it sounds good, it is. So if it's sounding good as your head from syllable to syllable, you may be onto something, especially if you have those other elements as play as well. And Chuck can talk a little bit in a moment about his working with Ed Sanders on extending those Pound qualities of verse beyond the three. But before I let you go, Robert, you were at the 1963 Vancouver Poetry Conference, and Olson was on the faculty of that. Maybe you can give us, a firsthand account of what it was like to engage Olson in such a setting.
A little. Unfortunately, I was quite poor in 1963, and I had to take a summer job. And so while I enrolled in the course, in the program for 3 weeks, I spent virtually every day of that 3-week conference at my job, selling shoes of all things, for $1 an hour or whatever I was getting paid. But I was desperately in need of the money, so I missed a lot of it. But of course, I got to some of the readings, and particularly to the one Olson reading that he gave on the Wednesday night, which was the night in which he read some of the poems from Maximus, what we now call Maximus 2, which then he was calling Maximus 4, 5, 6. And that was a wonderful moment because none of us had ever seen those poems. They were not in print yet. And later on, I did my entire dissertation on that section. So it was amazing what an effect it must have had on me. Sad to say, when he read on the Friday night, unfortunately, I was one of a couple of people that got busted for pot. And I was in jail very quickly. They just took us, myself and another fellow, and threw us in the slammer that night. And later that very evening, after Olson's reading was over, this is Friday night, the 18th, I think, of October, or the 16th, I forget which night was which. Warren Tallman, who was one of the people that had really structured that entire operation, that whole summer conference, mortgaged his house, I guess, and came down and bailed me out of prison, which was a tremendous act of generosity on his part, because I was a student, quite a bit younger than most of the other Tisch poets. He knew me and he knew who I was, but I wasn't like Frank Davy or George Bowring or one of the Fred Waugh, who were more substantially part of the local scene. But that whole summer was really quite remarkable nonetheless. And I learned a huge amount by being in Olson's presence. And as a result of that conference, I decided when I hitchhiked east from Vancouver to Toronto the following year, in the fall of 1964, I stopped in on Olson's class and sat in on his graduate seminar. And that was a remarkable experience for me because actually, quite simply, my hands sweated so profusely that I decided this is where I had to be. That's quite physiological. And it was really quite true. And so I went up to Charles afterwards. By that time, I'd gotten to know him in Vancouver, so I could, relate to him as a friend. And I said, Charles, how could I get into this course? I think it would really be something I'd be interested in doing. And he took me up to the departmental office and introduced me to the secretary, who took down the information necessary. And as a result of that introduction, I was granted a graduate teaching fellowship and got into the program the following January. So, and I had no intention whatsoever of going to graduate school. I had finished my BA. I was going to be a writer, maybe a novelist, certainly a short story writer, and maybe a poet. And the curious thing is that, it was Olson's presence in Buffalo that made me think, well, maybe graduate school would be something to do. And of course, I ended up getting a doctorate under Bob Creeley on Olson. So it came full circle for me. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Could I ask a question to Robert?
Hey, hi.
Hi, Robert. Ian Boyden here. And
yes.
I just really love what you just shared. What an incredible story. And going back to what you were saying at first about Fenollosa and the object or the image, one of the things that strikes me is that when we read projective verse, he talks at great length about objectism, but when he's talking about Fenollosa, one of the things I think that he's really getting at is the transference of energy, and that there's something very different there. That Fenollosa was really interested in how energy could transfer from one word to another, and he takes a long time equating that with actual natural process, and thereby I think it's inside there that we can really differentiate from Pound. So Pound read Fenollosa and he came away with the object, the ideogram as this solid object that was. But I think in a sense it might be almost like a misreading, or just it was kind of wherever Pound was at when he was reading Fenollosa, that he didn't pick up on what Olson then later was really trying to pull out or extract from that essay, and that is that that transference of energy is what occurs inside of the human voice when we pay attention to and use our ear to listen to words themselves.
Yeah. Am I still on?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, that becomes really, that's a really good point. And I think that's kind of what I was getting at by saying that the really key element in the projective essay is the concentration on the syllable. Because at no point does Pound ever say anything like that. You know, you stop to think of it. I mean, he talks about similar things. He certainly knew what he was doing with sound. But Pound's concentration was on the idea, and the idea coming from an image and going to another person. So the image was the thing that would carry that over. And the perfect example of that is, you know, his incredibly short imagistic poems or image poems, right? And that's where the whole thing started. And of course, it was a tremendous boost for the 20th century to get off on that wavelength. But where Olson goes from that to something new is where he talks about the importance of sound, as you said. And sound is something that's very, very much related to the human body. As you would know a lot more about that than I do from your chanting and from your experiences in China and so on. But this idea that the syllable is pre-logical, I think is the key word here. And that when you're really operating in the construction of a poem, or the writing of a poem, what you're concentrating on is how you're hearing what is going on inside your own physiological being and what is going on in the world around you. And if you're actually writing about that world, because you may be writing about something completely different, but if you're writing about that world, then you have to find the resonance in the sounds that come from yourself, right? And those resonances should in some way relate directly back to that world outside you. And I think it's that trust, if you like, or belief in that correspondence between what's going on with one's own physiological being and the physiology of the world itself, or the physical nature of the world itself. Also like the word physis, right, for the physics of things. Well, then you're probably going to be at least on the right mark. That doesn't mean you're going to write great poetry, but it does mean at least you know how to try to write great poetry. There's some other kind of magic involved in writing really good poetry that none of us can define, frankly. We can talk about aesthetics, we can talk about poetics like Olson does in this essay, but you can never quite determine how it will actually be achieved.
But the notion of going to something beyond simply the intellect, I think, is really important. And the notion of T.S. Eliot, who he's hammering there at the end, and I remember George Bowering, maybe it was in a poem of his or something, where he said, Cuba see, Eliot no, and using Eliot in that school, which, you know, and Williams himself said Eliot has, with a wasteland, set American poetry back 100 years, and maybe it was 200, I'm not sure. But the notion that you'd have to go beyond simply the intellect, I think, is very, very critical, and that's where the body comes in. Chuck Pirtle was at Naropa working with Ed Sanders when he started writing about other aspects, how to extend those Poundian notions of melopoeia, phanopoeia, and logopoeia into, I think they got into 5 or 6 more. Chuck, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I will. I just went and pulled the book off the shelf again so I can have a quote Ed on it. But yeah, 2 pounds, phanopoeia, melopoeia, logopoeia. Ed added 2 more, and then I reminded him of another one, which I had found in George Oppen. But the additional ones that Ed added were first mythopoeia, which is Olson, certainly. The universal strands that speak to the noumenal and absolute. Mythopoeia also covers explanations the mind reads out after long study and reflection. Those sudden clarifications illuminate connections on the grandest scale. So that's where all of Olson's vast study feeds into his perceptions of the moment, you know. And then there's the second one, or the 5th one, I guess it would be, is tromopoeia, which he associates with Sappho, but I kind of associate with Anne Waldman in a way. Tromos means trembling in Sappho, and tromopoeia means the excitation in the reader, in the auditor, and in the performer throughout the body from poetry. Tromopoeia, therefore, is the cluster of muse skills that guides performance, and also the mind as it performs reading the poem. And then in conversation with that, I told him that I had found this one in George Oppen's day books. And this is a note from Oppen that Ed quotes in his essay. And this is in Ed's essay, Creativity and the Fully Developed Bard, which is in this Naropa anthology, Disembodied Poetics, which may or may not still be in print. I don't know, but I'm sure it's available. Anyway, Noopoeia, that's Noopoeia. George Oppen made a note in his daybook. Pounds, Melopoeia, etc. Amazing to have forgotten Noopoeia, revelation. Amazing to have forgotten lucence, translucence. Noopoeia covers sudden clarifications, insight, and revelations on a localized poem by poem basis, as opposed to Mythopoeia, the biggest scale, as the secret mind whispers. Quoting Bob Kaufman. Yeah.
And you were doing that with Ed Sanders, whose latest book is this A Life of Olson, which just came out in the last few months, a sequence of glyphs on points of his life, work, and time. So those who wanted to follow the Olson trail with a guy who studied it as hard as someone like Ed Sanders and practiced it as well, including hugely the historical aspect of it, this would be a good place to start. And yeah, that was I forget who published this, but it's well worth continuing the work on what has become of projective verse or who's been practicing it. And then also the notion of proprioception is what I was thinking of when Robert was speaking. This notion of where the sense of where your body is in space. We don't think of proprioception until we start losing it, until we start knocking off things as we get older, or as we get sick, or as we get dizzy. And proprioception, where one's body is in relation to the universe, is of course the subject of another famous Olson essay. Are there any other thoughts before we close this as we approach the 1 hour mark? If not, I'm very grateful to Chuck Pirtle for suggesting we do this on what would have been Olson's 110th birthday. He's probably happy he didn't live to 110 since he got to what, about 59 or 60. So Chuck has been a great influence in my own literary life, leading me to a better understanding of what it was I was doing and where I could be headed. When he said, it looks like you're trying to figure out a West Coast poetics, that was the key to me that got me into going back to bioregionalism and thinking about a Cascadian poetics. And of course, if you think about Cascadian poetics, you think about the 1963 Vancouver Poetry Conference, which I think was the most seminal event in the history of this bioregions poetry. So, Robert, I'm grateful for that. Chuck, I'm grateful for your influences. And you were about to say something.
No, I was good, since the Vancouver Poetry Conference was mentioned, and Robert, yeah, I was fascinated to hear your recollections of both Vancouver and Buffalo. But I just recently saw the film about the Vancouver Conference, The Line Has Shattered. And for anyone who hasn't seen it and who's interested, that's available on Vimeo on demand. I think it's like a $4 rental, but it's well worth it if you haven't seen that and you're interested.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, that is a tremendous film. Yeah. Some of it's been transcribed, but it hasn't been published yet, unfortunately. And longer interviews were done than could have been introduced into the film, quite understandably. And they too are still not available, but it will be nice when they are, because myself and a number of other people that were at the conference in Vancouver were out for a kind of second conference, just a literary conference or a critical conference, I guess you'd call it, a number of years ago. And so we all got interviewed about this event, and it was good to have it on tape.
Well, I'm really grateful for this, Chuck. I'm grateful for all the people who attended. Of course, this is a lifelong study. I've been at it for 25 years, and I'm more than happy to talk to anyone via email or telephone or whatever about what I know of this. I don't think that anyone can really understand it in a lifetime except maybe for Olson himself. And I'm grateful for the work that he did and the doors that he opened, and the size of his gesture, and the fact that he has been of such great use for me, and also the man who turned me on to it, Michael McClure, who I miss every day. So thank you all for coming, and Chuck, thanks for your idea.
Thank you, Paul. Happy birthday, Charles.
Yeah, happy birthday.